So let's boldly go where no one ever really terribly wants to go, in terms of analyzing one of the most derided films in the Star Trek franchise, with Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. While on shore leave in Yosemite National Park, Captain Kirk, Spock, and Dr. McCoy await Mr. Scott to finish repairs on the newly commissioned NCC 1701A. However, on Nimbus 3, the so-called planet of galactic peace, a renegade Vulcan has amassed an army, which soon takes representatives from the Romulan, Klingon, and Federation governments hostage. Kirk and his crew are forced to take the janky Enterprise out to rescue the hostages, but seeing the leader of this faction serves a memory in Spock of Sybok, a fellow Vulcan that rejected the principles of logic, believing emotion was the path to ultimate knowledge. When the daring rescue mission goes awry, leading to the capture of Kirk and his team, a Klingon bird of prey complicates the situation, seeking to take out the famed Starfleet captain. Soon Sybok, who is revealed to be Spock's half-brother, demonstrates his power to relieve people of their inner emotional pain, which puts them under his sway, allowing him to commandeer the Enterprise on a course to a mythical planet at the center of the galaxy. There, he believes God awaits them to make good on his seemingly fanatical and psychologically manipulative beliefs. Kirk calls him mad, McCoy relives a terrible decision from his past, and Spock refuses to give in to his siblings' power as they approach the Great Barrier. Yet what truly awaits them there is far less than what Sybok envisioned, which may ultimately destroy them all. So being released on June 9th of 1989, Star Trek V was the feature film directorial debut of William Shatner, which completely came about because between Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, they both had clauses in their contracts that basically said whatever one would receive, the other one would get as well. So if Leonard Nimoy got a raise, William Shatner got a raise, and because Leonard Nimoy had directed the last two films in the franchise, Shatner would also be given the opportunity to direct one of the films as well. And so obviously he pursued that and developed this story between himself, producer Harv Bennett, and screenwriter David Lowery, who had previously written the script for the film Dreamscape and would go on to co-write the film Passenger 57, which I've previously reviewed here on the channel. It was such a very interesting thing in terms of the development of the story that he had, because a lot of people had problems with it, such as Harv Bennett and executive consultant and creator of Star Trek Gene Roddenberry, because as much as people have problems with the story that it is, the original story was going to be literal in terms of actually going off to find God and literally finding the devil there. And Gene was just not very happy having like indoctrinated religions and that type of subject matter associated with Star Trek. It was always said that he was very adamant about having it separated from the stories he wanted to tell. And so he actually approached two sci-fi authors in terms of Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov to kind of look over the script they were developing and address the issues he had in regards to that type of stuff and the sort of just the sort of inflammatory type of feel that he could have, that it feels that the story could have had. And after paying them a certain amount of money to go off and kind of write letters to Paramount to address these issues and stuff like that, to kind of put a little bit of a stop to it and force a little bit of a change to the entire thing, probably not nearly as much as Gene would have wanted. And things just kind of went off from that regard, even though they were up against a writer's strike. So in 1988, that was coming up on the cusp of everything, and so they had a shortened pre-production time to get things done, to develop the script. So whenever that strike hit, that's the script they were pretty much left with and had to go off from there. And all these other little things that kind of did a little disservice to the entire film as it went along. There were a lot of production difficulties. Not a real problem, because Shatner apparently ran a real smooth set. He had a good time making the whole film. He didn't have any conflicts with anyone. There was no tension. He ran a really good set. So everything moved very well in terms of how he handled things, how he directed people, how he handled logistics of various things. He handled things well, so there wasn't a problem in terms of infighting, but there were just a lot of hurdles that kind of stumbled the production as it went along, including the fact that Paramount was so very happy with how the voyage home turned out as a very lighthearted adventure, that despite how much Shatner wanted to tell a serious story here, they had a mandate that you had to make it light, you had to make it funny, you have to make it more like that to be much more commercially appealing. And they gave him more money on this film than they had on The Voyage Home. They gave him $12 million more for a total $33 million budget, which was very substantial in 1989. And the fact of the matter, this film brought back less than half of what The Voyage Home got at box office, getting about $63 million compared to the over $130 million the last film made. Really shows a lot of different things went into making this film a problematic type of thing that created a film that's not terribly good. And certainly that battling of tones in the whole film is very much a detriment to the overall consistency of this whole film, because basically everything involving Sybok is handled dramatically. It's handled seriously and with a certain amount of weight. But then because Paramount mandates this whole kind of lighthearted feel to it and have a jokey sense about it, David Lowery has to write in all these different pieces in the entire film that maybe it works better on script than it did in execution, or various other things that don't really hit very well, because I like so much the humor in Voyage Home because it felt natural, it felt organic, it felt just flowed out very much as a subtle type of style of comedy, where this thing is much more overt and kind of over the top in a certain place, and it's just kind of not funny in a certain way. It's like it's stupid funny instead of kind of smart, clever funny. And that's very much the difference between Voyage Home and Final Frontier in terms of their approach to comedy. And that's very much difference of tone, where Voyage Home very much had that feeling that you could have a fun sense about it with the scenario the characters are going through. This is sort of abrasive towards the tone and the style and the approach of the film, the story that's trying to be told here, so it doesn't flow organically. It doesn't have a natural sense about how these things are being injected. It just comes down to a type of humor where you're laughing at the characters and not laughing with the characters. You're not having fun with them. The film is doing stuff at their expense, and that's not a terribly good way to see these characters in. And obviously the comedy elements add into all these different things where the Enterprise is broken down and turbo shafts don't work and the view screen doesn't work and the transporters don't work, and kind of makes for a silly, unnecessary quality in the film that just adds more comedy into it just to have comedy. It doesn't add anything really too much to the organic sense of the story until you get to the climax and they're having trouble beaming people out, stuff like that. But you could find smarter ways to write around that if you weren't forcing comedy into the story. And of course, there's all the little things with like this dismissive continuity where they're in the empty turbo shaft with Spock's rocket boots and they start shooting up different floors where all the floors are in non-sequential sequence, and it says the Enterprise is like 77 decks where it actually does not. And all these little things with like Scotty and Uhura, who apparently now have some kind of romantic relationship which has never been established before and has never followed up on after this film, and just like comes out of nowhere and doesn't feel quite right. And all these little things just kind of inject themselves in a way that just doesn't feel natural. It doesn't build on things that feel like they come from the general sense of how we know the characters. It feels very much against their nature and follows them out of their own characterizations to make them do certain things in this film, which also comes up in a lot of the dramatic sense of the progression of the story, which I'll get to later on. But just the thematic elements of this whole film are kind of an interesting thing in terms of how they don't reach their potential, because you got this whole thing with the internal pain, all the stuff about faith, and all these little things that you're getting injected here through Sybok. They're interesting, especially when you get on later on in the film, where it's Sybok and Kirk and Spock and McCoy, and you're having this entire scene between these characters, and they're kind of discussing this, they're kind of confronting this, and you're having this entire thing of McCoy confronting the pain of euthanizing his father, which is a fabulous scene for D. Kelley to work with. DeForest Kelley doesn't get anything else too much in this film, but he gets this one phenomenal scene to work with, just like the emotional pain that you just viscerally and rawly feel from his performance is absolutely phenomenal. It's just wonderful type of stuff. But it's just all these little things that you're seeing Sybok trying to make everyone confront their pain and draw power from kind of expelling that from themselves. And then you have this sort of inverse type of thing with Kirk, where he doesn't want to express that type of thing. He doesn't want to let that out. He wants to internalize it and have that empower him and kind of bottle that up in a certain way. And there's such a way that you could deeply explore that type of idea of how either letting that type of stuff out can free you up and confronting your pain can make you stronger, but you can also have the entire perspective of how does internalizing it do something for you? How does it motivate you to keep that bottled up inside you and kind of use that pain, use those less flattering type of elements of your life to kind of drive you towards better ends and make you better decisions and make you a better person later on. So it's an interesting sort of thing that's put out on the table there and kind of courted for a little while, but it doesn't have as much as you possibly could really get into as a really interesting Star Trek sort of exploration of ideas, because it's kind of a thing that you got all the stuff with Sybok that he is kind of injecting that in the film, but you don't see the characters before that scene ever really dealing with that idea. You don't have that sort of like stuff as you could definitely show in Wrath of Khan, which is the most exemplary sort of thing to go back to talk about thematic elements in a Star Trek movie, where they have all the stuff in that whole film with Kirk dealing with his age and feeling worn out, and have that kind of twist in the narrative of how Khan is making him feel defeated and kind of depleted and stuff like that, and showing that he's not as sharp as he used to be, and have that kind of all weave together in the entire plot of the whole film. This film doesn't do that. This film doesn't take those ideas up front and have them slowly build up as the film goes on, and have Kirk kind of confront something about himself, or all the other characters kind of confront themselves in certain ways to build up to that point. It's kind of like it lingers there because Sybok is present, and then it gets confronted with the characters and they move on from it. So there's not really a grappling with those ideas. There's not really a depth as much as you possibly could get into to really kind of explore them as much as you can, because it is a fascinating idea to talk about and have a story deal with those themes and those ideas. It just doesn't get as much traction throughout the entire film as I think it possibly could, to have these types of characters deal with that type of idea. But getting into the performances here, especially with William Shatner being the director and co-writer and one of the leads of the film, I think he does handle that sort of thing very well. He handles both being the director and one of the leads and stuff like that very nicely. I think he still does a good job with the drama. It's not as good and strong as he's been before, but I think he still holds himself very nicely on screen as a dramatic actor. Certainly, again, the humor feels a little bit off. It feels like it's not as strongly consistent as even he was in the previous film. This one feels much more kind of like Shatner being funny instead of Kirk kind of adapting himself into those situations and having those types of reactions. It feels a little bit off in that regard. It doesn't have as much of a strong handle on that type of thing as possible. And certainly there's a bit of a different sort of combative nature in certain places between him and Spock and McCoy, where it's a little bit more kind of banter in a certain way. It's not as much like the philosophical type of arguments they had in the past and stuff like that, where they just had these heated arguments and stuff like that, where you had the logic and the passion and the humanity kind of bending itself back around on these issues. This one's much more kind of just infighting in a certain way, especially when you have Spock holding back the knowledge and the information that Sybok is his half-brother and all these different things. Then Kirk gets angry about it, and just like, it doesn't feel like there's as much synergy in the writing and that type of stuff to feel like you've got the warmth between the characters as much in the film. Certainly the campfire scenes has a little bit of that, but I just don't feel like there's as much of that spark going back and forth between the characters and getting it really, really good. It just feels like it falls off and doesn't have that sort of way it just clicks into place in so many of these other films and all these other stories we've seen the characters in. But Shatner does a good job. He does a fine job. When you have all these little problems that you're trying to appease the studio on certain things, but also still trying to tell the story you want to, it makes for a different type of thing. But the fact that Shatner, again, still ran a very good, smooth set really says a lot to him, and he still enjoyed the experience, and no one really had a complaint of how he handled things. I think that's at least a good thing to get to his credit on this whole thing. And Leonard Nimoy is a really kind of interesting type of thing, where he does have his moments in the film, but whether it's just, again, the content, the material in the script doesn't give him as much, or they kind of do much with anything, or maybe he's just not as enthusiastic about it. It just feels a little bit out of shape in the whole film. He doesn't quite feel like, again, he's clicking with what you have on screen. He doesn't feel as much into it as we've seen before. He doesn't have that sort of energy that you had before. I don't know if there's anything more to read into it, but just looking at him on the film, he looks a little bit off. He feels a little bit off the entire mark or the entire feel of the film, despite the fact that he has kind of the best humorous lines in the film, where he just has these sort of dry, deadpan type of straight man reaction to certain things, and all the stuff where, like, hold your horse, Captain, and the whole thing at the end where it's like he's the gunner on the Klingon ship to save Kirk and everything, and Kirk goes in for a hug and he says, "Please, Captain, not in front of the Klingons." So it's like he has some of the funniest lines in the film, genuinely funny lines, not stupid funny. They're good funny, good stuff that he has there, just because of how Spock is portrayed, how he has this sort of just that logical approach to how he says things. And just like, again, the straight man is usually the funniest thing in most comedies, that when you have him, he's really good in that type of regard. It just, like, again, you have this entire story between him and Sybok, and it doesn't feel like it has as much depth as you possibly get into. It doesn't have as much resonance that you get further deeper into the character of Spock, where you've seen him go through all these different things. You've seen him go through all the stuff with the feature and kind of come out with that with a different perspective and a little bit more of a sort of harmony within himself. And then he dies and comes back and has to have this entire way of kind of throughout the voyage home kind of restructuring himself, kind of putting the pieces back together to come back as a much more whole Spock, and certainly a different fashion, but he feels a little bit more put together and a little bit more clear in his head and his sort of way of thinking about things and approaching things, and how his relationships kind of organically develop in that film. Feels a little bit kind of a step back in a certain way in how he's presented this film. Spock doesn't feel quite as progressed in this film as he felt at the end of the last film. So it's just like everything just feels a little bit off in the characterizations, and you certainly had, again, some objectionable type of things, because as we see, Sulu and Chekhov and Uhura, they all get sort of brought into Sybok's sway. He has them all confront their pains and kind of gets them on board with what he's doing and everything. And Shatner originally was going to have Spock and McCoy also turn against him, so it's like it's just Kirk, man alone, against everyone else, and to have him as sort of this towering figure in the whole film, to be a little bit more bigger, kind of bigger over the top in a certain way, just a larger-than-life type of figure to go up against everything. The entire universe is against him now, and D. Kelley, Leonard Nimoy, put an absolute stop to that. It's like they had enough stroke in the entire development process and the creative process of everything to say, no, our characters would not do this type of thing. They would not turn our backs against Kirk. So they absolutely had that stroke to be able to change that away from everything. Of course, George Takei, Nichelle, Nichols, and Walter Koenig don't have that as much of a stroke to kind of step up and say that and kind of get that shifted away from them, where you've seen these characters through everything they have been, even in Search for Spock, when they go against Starfleet orders, and it's like we're going directly against it, we're breaking Federation law to hijack the Enterprise and go off and save Spock and everything. They put their careers, they put their lives on the line for these guys tons of times. So it's just very objectionable to a lot of fans that they would just be easily swayed to go against them and all that type of stuff. And it's just very much a sign of a lot of the different ideas that didn't work at all in this whole film. And so it's like, it's just very difficult to see that. And again, they don't get much work in this whole film. Nichols and Koenig and Takei don't get very much to do in the whole film. James Doohan gets a little bit of stuff, but is, again, more comedy type of stuff in any type of way. So it's only kind of Shatner who gets the most meat of anything in this whole film, aside from the fabulous Laurence Luckinbill, who they cast as Sybok in this whole film, where there was the original idea of getting Sean Connery. But David Lowery says we never would have afforded Sean Connery. He just would have been too much, and he had already signed on to Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade. So absolutely positively no way were they going to get Sean Connery, despite the fact that they named the planet Shakari. And so it's a little bit of an in-joke type of thing there in that regard. But Laurence Luckinbill, this guy that Shatner saw on him portraying Lyndon B. Johnson on this TV movie or something like that, and it's like, this guy is phenomenal. I think he's one of the best goddamn things in the entire film. And despite the fact that a lot of the other things in the film are to the detriment of maintaining a certain legacy for the character of Sybok here, I like the character. I love the actor. I like so much that he has such a passionate, theatrical sense about himself without going over the top. He doesn't chew the scenery. I like that he has everything just in the right degrees. He feels like a stage actor who just has that sensibility about filling a room and having that presence on screen, and all these different things kind of move about and have that magneticism you need to have for a character like this, who's almost portrayed as sort of a fanatical cult leader or one of these sort of televangelists that were going around at the time that Shatner was so kind of transfixed on in terms of writing this character, which was apparently a little bit more flamboyant, a little bit more over the top when they originally were writing it, but it got kind of trimmed down and kind of focused down to a little bit more of a character that you can really kind of get into and take a little bit more seriously and have more of an arc in this whole film. I like so much of what you do with this character here, what Luckinbill does with the character, and definitely the screenplay gives to him to work with. He's so confident in his beliefs about what he is doing that, again, Spock says that he was very much against the teachings of Vulcan, that he thought emotion was the path to knowledge and all that type of stuff, and he was very much kind of an outcast in a certain way. He was very much that kind of radical personality in a certain way. So it's so interesting to see that sort of thing develop, because as we've had in Star Trek before, Vulcans kind of adopted this sort of logical sort of mentality when their society was being ripped apart thousands of years ago from these intense passionate emotions, and they kind of found this other way to deal with things and kind of adopt a different mentality. But obviously Sybok takes in this entire different approach to everything, and so I like so much what Luckinbill just brings to the lushness of the character on the screen. He brings so much to it. He just feels so much about being enraptured with the characters. Like, I love so much that he's not a real villain in the film. He's an antagonist in a certain way, but he's not a villain. He's not like Khan or Krug or something like that. He's not a violent guy. He doesn't want bloodshed. He's fighting people with ideas. He's combating ideologies, stuff like that. He's not firing weapons or trying to kill people or blow things up. He has an ideology, a way of thinking, a way that is fanatical, is a little bit kind of on the fringe of crazy, but he's willing to test that so much, and he just keeps being proven right up until the very end, where he finds out that this creature, this entity that he's been seeking out at the center of the galaxy, and just like ends up being this manipulative, bitter entity that's been in prison here for probably millennia, but how his beliefs are manipulated, that probably this entity who's been locked up here for all this time reached out to his mind, sort of like V'ger did with Spock in the motion picture, and kind of tapped into that sort of ideology he had and kind of manipulated him a little bit here and there to kind of pull him out here, to use him to kind of break him free of this prison, and just like see that turn that Sybok makes at the end of the film. I like it so much that when he's confronted by this dark mirror of himself in the image of this god and everything, and he can't help but be regretful. He can't help but be confronted by the mistakes he made, the beliefs that were twisted and manipulated and destroyed by this entire creature. What he believed was kind of ruined by this thing, and he has to have that moment there. He has to confront it. I like so much that he doesn't have a real hesitation about it. He's just like, he's trying to understand it, but he goes up to Spock, he does the Vulcan symbol to them and him, and has that moment, forgive me, and he throws himself to kind of destroy this whole thing, that he led everyone down the wrong path. So I just like so much that he has a redemption at the end of the film. Might seem a little bit overclouded in a certain way, where you got the big spectacular effects action sequence after this, stuff like that, but I like so much that he does have an arc. You redeem the character at the end after all this stuff, where again, he never intended bloodshed, he never intended violence, he never intended death to anyone. He was trying to enlighten people and led down the wrong path towards something, and he immediately makes good on that type of thing to kind of mend his type of ways in that regard, to sacrifice himself to save everyone else. So it's like, it's a really good arc, and this guy is a fantastic actor. He hasn't done much more than like real character work over the years, but man, I love what he does in this character. I love Sybok so much. He's such an interesting character, so much because of what Laurence Luckinbill puts into the depth of his performance here. I love so much what he does. I love so many things that he does all across the board in this whole film. I think it's a wonderful performance that doesn't get as much credit because of the flawed film that is kind of encapsulated inside of. He definitely deserves more credit. He's a fantastic actor, and I do know there are a lot of people who do appreciate the character so very much. And a few other cast members to note in this whole film that kind of got a little bit of a redemption of their own is that you got David Warner here as St. John Talbot, who just completely wasted in his character of this Federation ambassador on this barren piece of crap planet Nimbus 3, the planet of galactic peace. He's got nothing to do in this film, but thanks so much. He got to come back in Star Trek VI as Chancellor Gorkon, and a fantastic episode of The Next Generation, a two-putter, Chain of Command, as Gul Madrid, a Cardassian. One of the best performances where he got cast at the last minute and pretty much read his entire script, his entire lines off of cue cards, and put in a phenomenal performance in that episode. Charles Cooper, who plays General Cord in this whole film, would come back twice in The Next Generation as the Chancellor of the Klingon High Council, Kempek, in Sins of the Father and Reunion. And George Murdoch, who portrays the entity posing as God at the end of this film, would come back as Admiral Hansen in The Next Generation two-part, The Best of Both Worlds. So these guys came back in a big way and got a real good redemption in that regard from maybe not as much to really kind of hang their hats on this film. Came back and got some really solid, phenomenal episodes to appear on and some other good films as well in this franchise. But I'm kind of disappointed in the Klingons in this whole film. I feel like they're kind of shoehorned into this film because we had so much great progression with Krug in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, with all the stuff that Christopher Lloyd was doing with that character, and got a lot more juice. You got more, maybe not as much depth with the character of Krug, but you got more of a fleshed out sense of the Klingons in that movie, and a little bit with John Schuck as the Klingon ambassador in Star Trek IV. This one just feels like stock Klingon villain of the week type of thing, where just like the Captain Clog character is just there to kind of create some dangers, something to shoot at in the whole film, and just like it, you could easily write it out of the whole film. It could be a lot more in regards to something like Star Trek the Motion Picture, as much as people have a issue with that, or even Star Trek IV. There was no main villain. You just had ideas. You had things to grapple with, the unknown or something like that, to kind of have the characters deal with that stuff without having something shooting at them all the time. So it's like, it just felt like a detriment, kind of a wheel back, kind of a reversion of the entire Klingon progression we had up to this point. But speaking about Klingons and shooting at stuff and stuff blowing up and all that type of stuff, well, the effects of this movie are a very story type of thing because they're not very good. And you don't have industrial light and magic involved with this whole thing because, again, they're working on Indiana Jones and Last Crusade and Ghostbusters 2 at the same time, which all get released about a month from one another in the summer of 1989, so they're not available, so they had to court other people to come onto the film and do some effects work. And they got this guy, Bran Farron, who did a fantastic job for his first effects sequence, which was the entire thing at the end of the film where the entity shows up as God, and that's kind of like the best effect of the entire movie. This wonderful type of thing where you got rear screen projection, all these bright lights, and all these really good visuals going on in that regard in that sequence, but they weren't up to the task. They could not handle the workload. They kept turning in stuff late. They could not get things done on the scale they wanted to, the same quality, process as much effects, as many layers to the effects to really kind of give everything as much of a quality as possible. So despite the fact that they had the same models that they already had from the previous films, they're not photographed as well. They don't have as much weight or gravity on the entire screen, don't have as much sort of scale, they don't have as much imposing quality. Just think of how good the Klingon Bird of Prey looked in the last two films and how kind of cheap it kind of looks in this film in terms of the effects sequences it's put through and how it's photographed. All these little things. It's still the same model of the Enterprise, but everything just looks kind of cheap. It doesn't look very good. And just like, it's a very heavy detriment to this whole film where you got a lot of effects in the whole film. You got a lot of stuff with matte paintings and various things where you got this entire glowing planet at the end of the film and having to create all these interesting things where there are effect sequences they could not get done in the film because they were too expensive and they looked cheap. The original ending of this film was going to have all these big rock creatures kind of bursting out of the planet at the center of the galaxy there to chase down Kirk. It was $350,000 for one of these suits. Shatner was disappointed by the quality of what they got from that amount of money, and the fact that there were supposed to be 10 of these things and they could not afford it, and it looked crap because they couldn't do the sequence properly. They couldn't do what they had to do because they were supposed to have all this fire and smoke going on. Couldn't do it with the suit that they created. And it was just a big fucking mess with the effects and the whole thing. It was really, really bad. They don't look good at all. I know there was a lot of stuff going on, I think, when they were putting together the special collector edition DVDs in the early to mid 2000s, where a lot of the fans were trying to get on board, trying to motivate. I think Shatner himself was probably trying to get Paramount to do maybe a special cut of the film, because they already did sort of the restoration on the motion picture. They did the director's edition cut of Wrath of Khan. He was trying to lobby for that a little bit, but they would not put out the money to do that, probably because it's not a very well-regarded film. They probably didn't think they'd make as much money back for what they had put into it to redo effects and stuff like that. So it's really the kind of, visually it's the worst element of this film, because the cinematography is fucking good. Well, Andrew Laszlo, this guy shot The Warriors and First Blood. This guy can shoot a fucking movie. And he's got some great visuals this whole film. I love the entire opening sequence there on the middle of the desert there on Nimbus 3. And you've got these wonderful slow motion shots of Sybok coming up on the horse and everything like that. You got all these wonderful camera movements that have dramatic punctuations on certain moments and stuff. I love this whole entire cinematography style put in this whole film. You know, if other things kind of fail, certain qualities in the entire film, Andrew Laszlo puts together a really good looking movie here. He does a really fine job to make the film look like a cinematic experience, despite the effects work not holding up to that quality. That's not his fault. Everything else he shot looks really good. You do have Jerry Goldsmith back providing the score for this film. Not as good as the motion picture score. That one has some of the best stuff I've ever heard from Jerry Goldsmith. This one brings back his themes. He brings out that wonderful Klingon thing, which I absolutely fucking love, which shows up a couple of times on The Next Generation, a couple episodes here and there. I just love that theme. He brings it back all the time. I love it so much. And his main theme, which was adopted already for The Next Generation, he brings it back with his full orchestration. Sounds absolutely beautiful. He does some really nice stuff again, building a little bit of synthesizers in there as he usually does. You get a really nice score. I really enjoy it. I got the one from, I believe it was Entrada here. They put it out again, so you can grab that up with a lot of extra complete stuff on the whole thing. So I really think he does a good job. It really adds in so much. Again, I think Goldsmith is just like, that's the sound of cinematic Star Trek to me so much. And even though there's a lot of other films where he's not present, I think there are some other composers, like I've said before, Cliff Eidelman in the next film, Giacchino, who's done the Abrams films. I think these guys have really nailed the sound of Star Trek, and Goldsmith really set the tone. And he really came back in this whole film and really just nailed something very special. I think it sounds really, really good. But at the end of the day here, looking at Star Trek V, it comes down to the script. If you don't have a solid script that feels consistent and has a tone that works towards what you want to do, it's going to fall apart in a lot of cases. And again, the concepts, obviously, don't kind of come together very well. Again, you have a lot of things that are... People can get into more of the scientific stuff in regards to other things, the whole film, how you could reach the center of the galaxy and all these other little things. I'm not getting into that. I'm talking about a story and how it fits into Star Trek. And I would probably agree with Gene Roddenberry. This story doesn't really feel like it belongs so much in Star Trek as much, because you're dealing with certain topics and certain subject matter that typically wasn't addressed in Star Trek, at least probably not until Deep Space Nine, where they started dealing with a lot of religious type of aspects of different things with the Bajoran people. But regardless of that, just talking about this whole thing, the ideas that Shatner wanted to explore in this whole film just didn't feel like they fit so much with what Gene Roddenberry envisioned, and what felt very comfortable and very much in line with what Star Trek really wanted to do as a message to people and have that sort of thing. I can talk so much about how the film doesn't work, but I do like mentioning what things do work. I like, again, Luckinbill's performance. Goldsmith's score is phenomenal. The cinematography is great. A lot of the other minor things kind of work here and there, but again, a lot of the film is just kind of a scattershot quality in regards to making things respectable and have an integrity, a kind of a dignity about itself. It loses that as it goes along. I know people who saw this in the theater at the time and didn't make it through to the end of the movie. And they're big Star Trek fans and love so much of the whole thing and have not warmed to the film at all over time. I've had a bit of an affinity for it. I have an affection. I don't hate the film in any regard, but it is not a good, well put together piece of work. There's so many things working against it that just didn't work out very well. And you can lay that at Shatner's feet. You can lay that at a lot of people's feet why things didn't work. It just was a wrong time with the writer's strike and Industrial Light and Magic not being available and having the wrong people on effects and all these different things. A lot of things just did not fall in the right places at the right times to be most beneficial to what you want to do. So, regardless of all that, I want to hear what you guys feel about Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, because I'm sure there's a lot of people who have a lot of different opinions of it. It was a major disappointment after Voyage Home was such a major success. It just like this made so little money in comparison to some of the other films. This almost killed it up until they did that film back there, Star Trek VI, for the 25th anniversary, which I'll get to later this year. But get your comments about Star Trek V down below and let me know what you feel, guys. Just let me know. So I'll be back in due time with other great stuff. Hope you guys are all staying well and staying safe. So thanks much. Take care. Live long and prosper.